All right, so here we go. So Bill Baue, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Very, very excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you for inviting me.
Cool. So you are actually my first interview on JBS. So I'm excited to kind of warm up the thinking on this. And I think you're also a great person to start with, just given your technical knowledge of the space. So gonna jump in here and I'll ask you to just describe who you are and whatever terms you'd like to put into the airwaves here.
Sure. Actually, I think from what we were just talking about before you turned on the recording, one of the ways that I describe myself is using a term that my good friend Raj Thamaratham from Preventable Surprises coined of positive maverick. That's a term that we at R3.0 kind of took from Raj and sort of generalized it from the finance space to just broadly, anybody who is engaging in the world and they see existing norms, existing ways that people do things that strike you as, not going to get the job done, not ethical, not, that you have an ethical obligation to challenge that. And my gig is I'm senior director with R3.0, which stands for Redesign for Resilience and Regeneration. And we frame ourselves as positive mavericks. So we're consciously inhabiting a space where we are challenging institutions, actions, players, et cetera, who from our perspective and also from a kind of empirical or evidence-based perspective are not acting sustainably or ethically, if you will. And there's a real dearth of people who can afford to, I recognize this is a privilege to be able to inhabit a space like that, because many people are in institutional settings where they actually they would have to incur too much career risk to do that. So, examples, and I think I'll end up touching on this, is that I was sort of an original instigator. I was sort of one of the people who planted the seed for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then served on their technical advisory group for a number of years, and then had concerns about their governance that I voiced privately and respectfully in the sort of positive aspect of positive mavericks. And then when they didn't respond, and when external evidence validated what I was saying, a scientific study, then I went public, and I've been engaging in a more activist mode. So all of that is those are some stories that could help to explain who I am and the angle that I'm coming from.
Cool. That's awesome. And yeah, I think we will dig a little bit more into various aspects of that. And one of the things I always like to do with these interviews is just explain how I am connected to the person I'm having a conversation with. And I actually feel like, Bill, you were the first person in the sort of ESG, environmental, social governance, sustainability space that I met at a conference when I first moved to New York City. So I think we met when the GRI was announcing that there would be ESG data on the Bloomberg terminals, and we were at the stock exchange in New York. So I feel like it's over a decade ago, and
it was. Yep.
And we've sort of been walking alongside doing different but related work ever since. And I feel very grateful to continue to sort of bump into you, learn from you. I've definitely drawn on the very public and generously offered resources of R3.0. I'll make sure that's in the notes to this conversation so people can find them. So it's a treat to have you on the line, and in particular, your knowledge of the ESG space, the background, the players, like how that information comes to exist is often missed from these sort of sustainability conversations. So I think it's kind of fitting that you're helping me set the stage for these conversations. So on that note, let's dive in. A couple more things to set the stage a bit before we go right into the company. The company being JBS. I just wanted to check if you have any direct relationship, commercial or otherwise, with JBS that we should know about.
No, and just to upfront this, I don't have a huge amount of even knowledge about them other than relatively superficial and some more specific knowledge. So actually, I won't be able to weigh in on real specific stuff about the company.
Yeah, no worries at all. And we'll see with the different stakeholders, there'll be varying degrees of specializing within the industry versus wider perspectives. So no trouble. Before we go into as much detail as we can on JBS and your thoughts there, I also really find it helpful to hear from stakeholders what you want from the future. So let me just set this up a little bit. As you and I both know, in the sustainability space, there's a lot of talk of the future we want. There's things like the sustainability goals, circular economy, all kinds of jargon and phrasing out there. I'd really like to hear in your own words, what is the future you want?
Well, as I'm looking up right now, I'm looking at snow falling, and I guess a very succinct thing to say is I would love to live in a world where snow still falls in New England, which is, one way of saying that. I would like to see a world that navigates through the predicament of climate change in a way where we maintain viability for the human species on this planet at a baseline. And I'm actually not particularly confident that that's something that's readily achievable at this moment. So I think that the evidence suggests that we humanity and particularly a certain segment of humanity is and has been for a long time undermining our viability as a species. So I would love to live in a future. I really embrace the notion of thrivability in sort of several years ago. I really was on that, and I do think that sustainability as a foundation for the potential for thrivability, the potential for humans to thrive, the potential for other species to thrive, the potential for life in general to thrive, and I've also embraced the sort of regenerative notion, and I see regeneration and sustainability as intimately interlinked. I don't see that regeneration is better than sustainability like some people do. I think that, in order to be sustainable, you have to regenerate continually. And you actually have to regenerate at a specific rate and amount. So just regenerating actually isn't sufficient. And this is, we actually need to regenerate in certain ways. So I guess that both answers your question and starts to give some of my core thinking out there.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, I want to go a little deeper into that because just foreshadowing, and you already hinted, we'll maybe go deeper into the science-based targets work as well. So just holding that thought and staying with your views on sustainability and regeneration, can you say a bit more about what you would like to see regenerating? So like what's changed on the ground, or what's different in that future compared to where we are now?
Well, I guess, at the simplest level, you could say that the economic system that we, generally speaking, are following right now, so, call it monocapitalism or capitalism that's exclusively focused on finance, call it late stage capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, whatever, that system actually is structured in such a way as to inherently be degenerative and unsustainable. And you could even go back, I'm reading some work right now that links modernity and coloniality as violent and unsustainable. So I think that if we just look at it, that we're actually existing in not just an economic system, but I would argue a broader cultural paradigm that is inherently degenerative, unsustainable, and violent, that just is not that's not viable. It doesn't, it's counterproductive. Even for those who benefit in the short term, it's actually counterproductive, I believe. So, what I would like to see, what I think when I look at sort of how systems work, that, because of the arrow of time and because of living life needing needing resources to continue to live, we need continual regeneration. And so, for planet Earth, many natural systems do regenerate in ways that living beings can benefit from. And then, on the human side of things, we're needing to continually regenerate ourselves. So as natural systems, like, right now, my cells are going through a regenerative process. And the knowledge that I have individually and the knowledge that we share collectively is in a continual state of needing to be regenerated. I need to teach my children about the things that they need to understand in the world, and they need to learn those things on their own. So I think that social resources and natural resources need to continually regenerate in order for life to continue on in the beautiful way that it does. And so, in some ways, we need to get out of our own way or stop undermining ourselves is one way to kind of put it simplistically.
Okay, great. Love it. And that's a good, I think, good precursor for where we're going to go here. So we're going to explore JBS's relationship with that future that you describe, and recognizing you are not showing up as an expert in the meat industry or a JBS focused analyst. So that caveat, I want you to think about the positive impacts for a moment, the potential activities or impacts that JBS can have or is having, to the best of your knowledge, on creating that future, and any things that come to mind in terms of evidence or examples where JBS is helping make that future happen.
I mean, I can talk in a very general way from my understanding of regenerative agriculture, for example, and in particular, the savory angle of holistic management, which, for those who don't know, holistic management is a broad term, but it's most often applied to agriculture, and in particular to animal agriculture and cattle in particular, because of the, broadly speaking, holistic management is about managing something like a ranch in the case of cattle, in a way that takes the whole of the systems into account. And so when that comes to the question of cattle, cattle actually have evolved in a way that's synchronistic with their environment. And so cattle that are managed in a holistic fashion actually have the potential to contribute in a climate positive way. That's what some of the claims are. And I've seen some evidence that really underscores that and supports that. So that if you're managing cattle with grazing with, I forget the term, but when you're moving the grazing around, sorry, I can't.
That's okay. Sometimes called cluster grazing or
yeah. Exactly. The cattle are they're laying cow pies that become the fertilization for the soil. That they are eating grasses at a rate that actually enhances the carbon sequestering capacity of those grasses, and that they're actually that carbon soil density, I guess, actually helps water better. So there are all sorts of potential benefits of cattle or dairy animal agriculture. The positive side of things. That's not necessarily what JBS is doing right now, and particularly, the question of becomes an important issue. Is that this can be beneficial, in particular when it is applied on lands that are not well suited for particularly like crop agriculture. Or when they're integrated into a sort of agroforestry type approach. So, those are all kind of caveats in that holistic vision. I guess the last thing I would say is that I'm kind of skeptical that JBS could support this, but also, there are many indigenous cultures that our existing economic system is hostile towards the cultures themselves, and the economic viability of those cultures. Whereas those cultures, generally speaking, I'm not to paint a brush across all indigenous cultures, but many indigenous cultures have evolved ways of coexisting that are could fall under the category of regenerative. And so the potential for social benefits of honoring indigenous cultures, or subsistence farming, for example, that kind of approach, that may be completely anathema to JBS's business model, but just thinking pie in the sky, that these things could actually vision.
Yep, love it. Great. I'm going to prompt you to think in the sort of opposite direct future that you want. And from what you understand of JBS, where would you see that they're currently undermining that future, or that there are activities or impacts that might undermine that future's ability to be realized?
Yeah, I mean, I think that concentrated agricultural approaches, concentrating animals into smaller areas is CAFOs is particularly problematic. Certainly, deforestation to open up lands is problematic, because the forests are serving purposes right now for biodiversity, and just in some ways like a forest's inherent right to exist. That's problematic. I mean, honing in maybe a little bit of the level of specificity. There's a lawsuit a complaint that just got filed by Glenn Hurwitz and Mighty Earth at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, that is charging that JBS was issuing green bonds, so bonds that had supposedly some environmental benefit associated with them, that were essentially fraudulent, is what the complaint is alleging. And so I think that's something that I think an assessment of J with that. I guess I would also point to Rainforest Action Network has done some engagement looking at JBS in particular, and at the claim by their science-based targets initiative, or claiming to have a science-based target, and the fact that they have made that claim but not actually had a validated target. So there's a number of layers of potential concern here. Yeah. The most sort of the most initial one would be that a company can make a claim to be have submitted a target for validation and immediately get the sort of halo effect of that. Any kind of, they may have their target may be completely invalid. So that's just at the very outset. And then as you deepen the layers, the validation process itself has elements of it that are problematic. And I'll maybe just pause there because I'm not sure how deep you want to go in on that one. But just to say that the core practices have a kind of obfuscating effect where companies can use narrative or linguistic devices to make them seem as if they're doing something sustainable when an actual rigorous assessment of them would find the exact opposite.
Yeah, okay, this is great. There's a lot of places we could go here. There's two in particular that I want to pick up on, and you can take both or one or neither. And bearing in mind, I'm at the early stage here of the assessment, so I don't have all the data in front of me, and I'm going a bit on what I'm up the pieces of and gathering, and you are going on what you know, not having analyzed JBS closely. So the next few minutes are going to be sort of us comparing notes on what we're noticing in the wider world versus a particularly agnostic type conversation about JBS. But I think it's important to go there, and you're one of the out there that knows stuff about the technicalities. The first is about that green bond, and then I want to touch on science-based targets. On the green bond piece, one of the things I'm keen to dig a little deeper into was what I found surprising was the way that that was positioned as a kind of whistleblower moment, calling out the green bond as fraudulent, when what I can see, they're not actually hiding the information about how it's framed. And the complaint is that it's just looking at scope 1 emissions, where that's not where their majority impacts will be. And so a couple things make me wonder where the value of that activism is. In particular, when I've looked at most green bonds, when you really follow the details, the proceeds of the bond are far from pointed towards regeneration. Like, it's usually at best something like renewable energy, or kind of, you know, there may be ways the proceeds of the bond not necessarily bad, but far from regenerative. So I look at what I see in the disclosures, and again, I have not done a deep dive, but I looked at the framework that they're using to kind of articulate how the bond proceeds must be used, and it kind of looks parallel to everything else I see out there. So I didn't notice fraud, and the term whistleblower felt a little sensationalized, but I may have missed it. And I'm curious if you have a point of view on that, and I definitely have to do more digging. And relatedly, so I'll put the second question here and run with as much or as little of this as you like. On the science-based target piece, you mentioned there's a lot of layers, and it's a big part of why I wanted to talk to you, because I'll describe the layers as I understand them, and then it's just like, whoa, what are we even trying to do here? Layer 1 is that, as you say, just the halo effect of saying we're trying to finalize a science-based target is almost meaningless, because like, oh, well, what is it, and is it enough? And then you could go deeper and say, well, let's say it is a really good target. Let's just say we figured out what that means and we're going there, but it's still 2050 and there's no clear pathway for you to get there. And then I feel like there's a couple more layers, one of which is what you have been very diligently doing, which is saying, even if they had a clear path and the target was good, the way in which the science-based targets are being kind of sorted and confirmed has some structural problems. And then I'm going to throw in a wild card and say, we're hyper-focused on carbon and carbon accounting, where a company such as JBS, whose whole raison d'etre is to bring livestock-based food into the marketplace, and there's so much more to the climate story than carbon accounting there, as you've already mentioned, ecosystem restoration, holistic grazing, etc. So that was a great big bundle of like, what do you think is actually meaningful in there? And do you have a critique that JBS could be paying attention to, or do you actually think there's positive things hiding in there?
Well, thank you for asking 15 questions. And
Yeah, sorry. It was a bit of a
that's
Russell Brand
a
moment.
response
Yeah.
to me putting out 15 different things for you to filter through.
Yeah, no worries.
So just going back to the green bonds question, I think so viewing it through the lens that you were saying, which is they're actually doing what a green bond is supposed to do. So there's sort of like, truth in advertising, if you will, and is this fraudulent? My own perspective is that there's a lot of activity in this space that we operate in that, before you hit the record button, it's like, well, what do you call it? The ESG space, the sustainability space. Those two terms, in fact, I've been trying of late to really clarify the distinction between these two terms. And I think, the most important thing that the green bond would come in under is there is activity that one can do that is not bad. And I use the term, it's incremental. So it's incremental movement. It might be in the right direction, if you will. But it raises the question of, well, if you're heading in the right direction, don't you want to actually get to the place that you need to be? So this is the key sort of distinction point between ESG and sustainability, is that ESG, and I'll have to sort of explain a bifurcation in the ESG space. But ESG, no matter how you slice it, is an incrementalist doctrine. It says, let's go somewhere at some pace. We're not going to measure sort of what the end goal is. We don't even know what the end goal is. We just know that we're going to head in a direction that seems like it's kind of okay. And that is doable. Arguably, the reason that ESG has taken off is because it's something that one can do in the existing destructive capitalist system that you can do without having to transform your existing business model, without having to transform the economic system. You can appear to do slightly better than last year and get all sorts of halo effect for it. So I think that where I would agree with this, that essentially the green bond market is fraudulent in the sense that it's making an implicit case or an implicit sort of promise, if you will, of delivering green or delivering environmental sustainability. And yet it has no means, it has no mechanism for actually delivering on the implicit promise. All it can deliver on is, will be slightly less bad this year than last year. That's the same thing problem with the ESG space. And ESG, just to go one layer deeper, ESG originally was just about essentially saying, oh, by the way, you do have to fulfill your fiduciary duty, even on things that are environmental and social. So ESG in some ways delivered absolutely nothing new. It just reminded people that your fiduciary duty doesn't end. You can't just ignore your fiduciary duty if the issue involved happens to be environmental or social. If your financial performance is adversely impacted, so if the outside world is coming into your company and it's adversely impacting your financial performance, you have a duty to address that. Okay, so that's the outside in. Early on in the ESG sort of story development, if you will, people didn't really understand that. And they sort of said, well, environmental social governance, this must have to do with creating a positive effect in the world. This must have to do with the inside out impacts. So in other words, the impact of the company on the world. That didn't exist in the definition of ESG. It didn't, the people who created ESG did not have that, at least that direct. It was sort of like that would come if sort of we took care of the fiduciary duty problem first. So this inside out is really where I think a huge problem is that if you're going to address your accountability for your impacts in the world. If I'm a company and I believe that I need to operate ethically, in other words, that I believe that if I have an adverse impact in the world, that I'm accountable for that and I need to address that. Which, by the way, is not the way that our economy operates. Our economy, as I've said fairly visibly, is sociopathic and narcissistic. It's basically like, well, if the world impacts me negatively, that's a problem. If I impact the world negatively, hey, that's how we do things, So this is where ESG and sustainability are distinctly different. Is that if you have an adverse impact on the outside world, or if you have a duty or obligation to have a positive impact on the outside world, the question is, well, how much of that impact and on what rate? And that's where sustainability comes in. So essentially, ESG, even when it was used on inside out impacts, is meaningless unless you say the how much question. How much impact? How much restoration? How much is needed in order to, at the very least, have a sustainable system? And so that's where I think that the ESG and sustainability come into play. So coming back to your question about the green bonds, really, in order to be a green bond, it would need to say, you need to have this positive impact at this rate that is sustainable in order to really be a bona fide green bond. So you're right that the problem may not be with JBS. The problem may be with the green bond market. Might be what that's revealing. Shifting now over to science-based targets, and I'll just say here that I have a pretty in-depth critique that's been in play for almost 2 years now publicly. It's been in play 5 or 6 years overall. But essentially, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, one of the governance problems that they've got is that they started out looking at all possible methods for calculating a science-based target or a greenhouse gas emissions target that is aligned with the climate science and particularly the decarbonization pathways or scenarios that climate science puts out. So Science-Based Targets Initiative is this consortium of 4 major bingos, big international NGOs, not non-governmental organizations, CDP, WRI, WWF, and UN Global Compact. And essentially, in 2018, they went from saying, okay, we're just going to weigh in on the pros and cons of all of these methods, to saying, without even consulting their technical advisory group, they said, we're only going to validate, we're only going to say that these 2 methods, which happen to be created by Science-Based Targets Initiative, were usable. And these other methods that were predominantly independently created were invalidated. That they said that they were illegitimate, but they never produced any evidence as to how they came to that determination. Every time I talk to the CEO, every time I talk to the chair of SBTI, I'm like, just give us the evidence. And if it shows what you say it shows, then I'll shut up. Change. So there's a governance issue where SBTI, this becomes problematic in that there have been now 2 scientific studies that say, hey, actually the strongest method is one of the methods that was taken off the table by SBTI. So this sort of self-dealing conflict of interests governance problem is not just a governance problem, it's an actual performance assessment problem, because they're saying, sorry, companies, you can't use the method that the scientific community is generally saying. And these are the only 2 sort of comprehensive assessments that we've got so far.
Wow.
So that's one problem. And then I'll just briefly say the other problem, because I know we're kind of, the clock is ticking. or another problem or a cluster of problems is that science-based targets does not call for the kind of transparency that would be required to follow the scientific method of independent verification of results. So if it were actually science-based, it would say, okay, companies, you have to reveal your, all of the information that would be needed for somebody to independently recreate these results. They don't do that. The final thing, and this is sort of what really got my critique picked up by the Financial Times in particular, was that science-based targets is serving three roles right now. They're the method creator, they're the standard setter, and they're the validator. And that is just a structural conflict of interests. So science-based targets is now being paid in order to validate the alignment of these targets with the standard that they set based on the methodologies that they created. And that's just a morass of conflicts of interests. And it's unresolved at this point.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for clarifying all that. I mean, I think the conclusion there is that it's inconclusive, but it helps put into context why JBS having a science-based target may or may not have positive impact. So really appreciate you spelling that out.
Lorraine, just to take a real quick tie-in here, the part of the reason that this becomes problematic is that JBS did a bunch of its bond raising using its status as having applied for the science-based targets as a specific. So these two things actually do come together, that it could be that JBS, their target isn't validated, but they've already got all the money in from these bonds. So that's the specific concern that the Rainforest Action Network has identified and has tried to explore with science-based targets, sort of unsuccessfully up until this point, is my understanding.
Wow, that's really interesting. So it's sort of tying it to something where there's maybe no there there.
There might not be. And so that's a sort of a structural problem. So even if there is, it's like the potential that there might not be a there is problematic.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks for that further context. And I'm just going to double check. I think I'm sharing my screen, and I'm hoping you see a slide that has a little bubble floating off to the right here.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'm going to quickly walk us through this, and then we've just got a couple kind of closing questions, so we should be good for time. This is kind of funny because you know me, and I sort of reject the whole mainstream materiality thing, and I say having a matrix is absurd, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm kind of being falling into my own trap here. But the real objective here is to hear your thoughts behind the answers to the question versus the answer itself. Here come the questions. So we talked about the future you want, and I very roughly break that down into a company's impact on an ecosystem's health. That's the vertical axis here. And on society's health. That's the horizontal axis here. And what I'd like to ask you to do is tell me, if JBS were this bubble that's floating around here, where would you say they belong based on what you currently understand to be their business model and how they function in terms of contributing to the future you want? And anything below the horizontal line would be that they are undermining ecosystem health. Anything to the right of the vertical, anything to the left of the vertical would be that they are undermining societal health. And then obviously anything above and to the right would be that they're contributing to environmental and social health. And mostly I'd love for you to tell me where to place this and why. And you can totally reject the question or just kind of sound out what makes the most sense. It's kind of a thought.
No, I mean, first off, I appreciate that your materiality matrix focuses exclusively on the actual impacts of the company on the outside world. So that's not, you're already distinguishing yourself from the majority, almost all, like that layer actually got totally removed from the global reporting initiatives, sort of unnoticed. I kind of called it out.
Noticed.
I know there are definitely some people noticed, but I would say that most materiality nowadays is bullshit materiality. It's just not really addressing the actual impacts on the outside world. So for this particular exercise, I would put it definitely in the lower left quadrant. And for both of those, and call it, -3 and -3 for the point that I don't, have enough specific information. But broadly speaking, the form of business model that JBS has negative impacts ecologically and socially due to both its sort of concentrated impacts on a localized environment and on the displacement of sort of forests, I think is specifically problematic. And then the concentration of wealth to the managers of the company and the investors, as compared to where the real value, if any, is being created, it's certainly not by capital. It's not by financial capital and provision of that. It's by farmers on the ground who are actually doing the work, which I have deep respect for. And I resent that our economy has essentially required farmers to pursue unsustainable practices that they probably wouldn't pursue otherwise, because I know a lot of farmers and I have a deep respect for them. So I want to distinguish the critique here, that it's of the corporate entity and the business model in particular. So that's my response to that one.
Awesome. Thank you for humoring that, knowing it's a rather specious exercise. I'll stop the screen share there, and I'll bring us into a kind of imaginative scenario state just to bring us home here. So couple questions here. The first is that this just in, I just actually got a bit of news. You are in charge of everything. There's nothing in the way. You are king of the universe. And so given that, I'm just curious what changes you would make at JBS.
So I guess I would look at their core business model, and I would likely change that. But I think that actually scoping up bigger and looking at what influence JBS has on the broader economic system design would actually, I think, be a much more important place to go. And then to go, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but then also to scope down to the very sort of on the ground, if you will, and essentially to look at empowering the rights holders, or not empowering as if JBS has the right or the power to empower other people, but to recognize the innate empowerment of its rights holders. And so that would be, both the farmers who are doing the hard work that it capitalizes on, or decapitalizes, you might say. Peter Tunjic might say decapitalizes, and the communities that it's both operating in and impacting. And I'm going to, hazard the guess that those net sum impacts are negative. So essentially working directly with those rights holders to redesign its business model in a way that is actually beneficial to them first and foremost. And then sort of the scope back to the sort of economic system side of things. I believe that our economic system is not going to change voluntarily. It's most likely going to change through the collapse dynamics that have been in play for at least 50 years based on the limits to growth research, but probably even longer than that. My understanding is that the Anthropocene started in 1610. That's what Lewis and Maslin's with the genocide of indigenous communities in the Americas was the point at which we entered the Anthropocene, because that's visible in the geologic record. So essentially, we've got a business model, if you will, that's about 500 years old, if not more, that has this disruptive. And large companies do have outsized influence on the economic system. They're currently operating in that system, and so they've been dancing to that tune, understandably. That's sort of like what they're built to do. Companies that are actually self-interested have a self-interest in transforming that system, because that system is ultimately going to result in their demise and our society's demise. So I would invite large companies such as JBS to ally with other companies in their sector and then across sectors to advocate for a wholesale transformation of our economic system, and therefore, flout their fiduciary duty to maximize their profits. So this obviously, would take a huge amount of gusto, is the term I'll use to be G-rated about it. But do I see this happening? It's difficult to imagine, but it's also absolutely necessary for that to happen.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it was a bit of fake news, the headline about you being in charge of the universe, which is really too bad, because I actually love where you were going there. But the exciting thing is, I just got another headline. This one's pretty cool, which is that obviously you have a direct line with the current CEO. So Gilberto Tomazoni, he takes your call. He wants to know what you think. But the thing is, he's pretty busy. He's running a pretty big concern. So he's only got 30 seconds and he's on the line. What do you tell him?
I deeply respect your leadership position, and I would encourage you to leverage that leadership in a way that respects both current generations, including yourself and your rights holders, and future generations to be able to inherit an earth that's worth living on. And so your role as the CEO of this large company is to shift away from profit maximization into maximizing or optimizing your balanced relationship with the living earth. That's not that's not a on Monday, but
absolutely beautiful. And I hope he does take your call. It was also fake news, that one, but I think nonetheless your voice is in the mix and being heard. And that's the last question I prepared for you. Is there anything I didn't ask you about just while we're live here with relation to the future you want and JBS that you want to make sure you put on the table before I give you back your afternoon?
No, I think your questions are pretty comprehensive, and your approach is something that I think is really looks at the world through a different lens. So I appreciate it, Lorraine.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate your insights and time. So with that, I'll pause the recording here, but deep thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Lorraine. It's been a pleasure.